Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Fact, the series that discusses international issues every week. Today we would like to talk about the recent event, the assassination of General Soleimani, which happened a few days ago by the order of United States and Mr. Trump. And today we would like to go into details with two respected guests, Mr. Paul Larudee, political activist and founder of the Free Gaza movement, and he's joining us from USA, and also Mr. Tobias Pfennig. He is also an international activist, and he's joining us from Germany. I would like to welcome both of you to the program, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I would like to start with the first question from Mr. Larudee. As you know, General Soleimani has been going to Iraq several times, and it was actually his regular plan to go and visit there and see the situation by himself. And this time he was also on an official trip to Iraq. But why Trump or USA tried to assassinate such an important person in an official trip? And in such a situation, I would like to go into basically details of the reason. So would you please explain about that? Thank you.
Well, General Soleimani has been a U.S. target for quite a long time. There have been questions of the opportunity to assassinate him and the appropriate moment to assassinate him. Soleimani has been cooperating with Syria, which the U.S. has been attempting to overthrow and destroy. He has been cooperating with Hezbollah and supporting them. He is an enemy. He represents Iran in being opposed to the existence of the Zionist state of Israel. And he's been quite effective in his military support and operations, both in Iraq and against terrorists such as Daesh. And he hasn't participated that much in anti-Al-Qaeda operations, but the anti-Daesh actions have put him at odds with the U.S. because the U.S. has essentially used Daesh and encouraged Daesh and supported Daesh with funding and arms and so forth, and training even, on numerous occasions in order to use them for their goals against Syria and the Syrian government and against Hezbollah. So these are all reasons why the United States would want to assassinate Soleimani, but this particular occasion was very tempting, and they didn't resist the temptation. Why was it? Because he was in the company of AbuMahdi Almuhandis, who is also a target of the U.S. and is considered and is also fighting against Daesh. So it was really a target that was hard for a temptation, if you will, that the U.S. and particularly Donald Trump and his advisors found hard to resist. So they went for it. I think they're aware of the consequences, which are not necessarily good for the United States, but they felt that the benefits outweighed the potential problems that could happen as a result of it.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we would like to go to actually to the international law aspect and see if such an assassination would violate any kind of international law or regulation, and I would like also to ask if such an act would basically be a state terrorism. So, Tobias, would you help us about this question? Because as you know, AbuMahdi Almuhandis and also General Soleimani, both of them were the leaders of two official military service of two countries. And this kind of act would normally, bring up the question of whether this, act would be a violation of international law, and also would it be an act of terrorism? So, what's your idea about this question?
So, first of all, I think we need to realize that, of course, it's in violation of international law. Targeted killings, like which happened in Afghanistan by the US, which happened in Iraq by the US, which happened even in Syria by the US, and which now happened again in Iraq by the US. Of course, targeted killings are not at all legal. There is no process in front of some kind of court. There is nothing, just people are just getting killed because somebody is pushing a button in Washington or in the White House or right now in the Trump Tower. So basically that's it. So we cannot argue about that. This is of course illegal. It is against international law, but we also need to keep in mind basically that international law, it is made by the superpowers. It is made by the people who are not themselves obliged to actually keep and stick to this international law. So it's very easy. If you look, for example, about to Israel, for example, which is using white phosphorus, which is using this white phosphorus against the Palestinians, against civilian targets, then you will see basically they don't have to stick to this international law. And you see the same in the case of the US. They are not sticking to the own laws which they made. But they can do this out of a position of power. They can do this because the strongest, like Muammar Gaddafi said, the strongest will always rule. So basically, if you're in the position to be strong, if you're in the position to do something, you're not obliged to this international law, and that's one of the main problems. So the whole problem, for example, the United Nations, is that there are countries which don't have to stick to their own laws, which they set in the United Nations, and nobody can do anything about it, because what can you do? You can just start a war against these countries. You can just attack them, and that's the only possible solution. So how can we, for example, now apply sanctions upon the US? How can we make a UN resolution against the US? It just won't happen, because the US can use its own right to veto in the United Nations. So basically, all of this is just a big show. How can we talk about international law if international law only applies to countries which are enemies of the big players in this world? So please let us forget about this term, because I think it's not the right term. Can the US do these targeted killings? Yes, it can, because they have drones, they have the power to do it. So I think we should think about how we can prevent the US from doing something like that, how we can, for example, lock up the airspace over Iran, over Syria, and so on, and over Iraq, to not let something happen like this again. I think that's the way more interesting question. And of course, we can talk about possible consequences and sanctions and so on. But in front of the international law, in front of these institutions, it just won't happen, in my opinion, because they are dominated and ruled by the US, by the NATO powers, and the Western hegemony. That's it.
Well, as you know, this event and this, I can say, disaster has made some waves of movements in different countries, and there has been few, I can say, protests and manifestations in different countries. And I would like to know, how do you actually analyze such movements and such global reactions toward this assassination? So, Mr. Larudee, do you think there is any kind of special analysis behind this global, response or reaction toward this event?
United States policy, in accordance with the principles that that it ignores international law. International law was fine when the United States in the United States economy was 50% of the world economy right after World War II. It could wink its eye, and the rest of the world would respond without much resistance. Things are different now. The United States is losing a lot of its power, but it is struggling by putting its by forcing its way, not by persuading its allies and the rest of the world to do what it wants. In this case, this act of international gangsterism, we could say, is not being received in many quarters as acceptable. Even the allies, the so-called allies of the United States, that historically have been among the colonialist powers, even they are in many cases criticizing the United States for this belligerent action, and this the United States is relying more and more on its military forces to coerce governments around the world. It's not being anything like subtle. And this only moves in the direction of creating resentment, let's say, in many more quarters and to a greater extent than ever before. This cannot continue forever. The United States is gradually losing its its power. It is a declining superpower. And the result is that it must depend more and more on brute force in order to gain its will and to maintain its power in the world. I think this indicates a power in decline, and I think the rest of the world will push back on this. I think they already are, and I think we'll see more of that. I think Russia and China and other powers will step in to try to get assurances from the United States to back off and not be, and to maybe even to apologize, although I doubt that the United States will apologize on this. But I think that the world reaction, world response is very negative towards the United States in general. There are very few, with the exception, obvious exception of Israel, which, if anything, wants even more aggressive action, and it agrees with.
Okay, thank you. And apart from all of these reactions, as you know, in Iran, there has been a huge wave of anger among people toward this event. And as you know, even those people who were not so pro-Soleimani or pro-IRGC in Iran, they actually came out in order to show their anger toward this act of the United States against our official military service. So I would like to ask Tobias, do you think what would be the reason behind this kind of I can say gathering and this kind of unity among Iranian people who with different ideas came out and showed their angers?
I think Soleimani, he was a real, like everybody, he was an everyday guy, he was an ordinary person, and you saw it in every of his actions. Like, I think he was even traveling from Syria or Lebanon to Iraq on some kind of public airplane, on some kind of cheap flight, you know. So even I think there were pictures of his coughing returning from Iraq to Iran, and I saw him like his coughing on some kind of public flight also over there. So he was really an everyday guy. He was going to the front line with his soldiers. He was going to the front line to check out what is going on there. And a really good commander, he should really do that. He should be at the front line, seeing what the actual situation is. And he did it in Syria. He did it in Iraq. He did it on many other places like in Lebanon. So he was really an everyday guy who was like a guy from the people. He was one of the people, one of the Iranian people. And of course, the Iranians feel attacked by it. So if somebody like him, who's even like a high-ranking military official, can get killed, can be targetedly killed by the US administration just by some push on some button, so then every Iranian citizen can be killed at any time by some airstrike from the US. If somebody goes from, an Iranian citizen goes, for example, to Iraq or to Syria or to Lebanon, can he be safe? Can he be killed at any time by some US drone or anything like that? So that's of course a question which Iranian people are also asking themselves right now. So that is of course a very important issue, and that he's one of the Iranian people, he's one of the military, he's one of the whole Iranian people itself. Even if you might be liberal, if you might be conservative, whatever, it doesn't matter in this kind of case, because he is one of them. He is one of the Iranians. So an attack onto him was attack onto all of the Iranian peoples, or we can even go and say further, an attack on all to the resistance forces, onto all of the Shiite people, and so on. So it was something which is uniting the Iranian people right now, which is something really valuable, and something which is very important for the Iranian people itself also, because I think that the society is split up into many factions right now. But of course this attack will unite the Iranian people against their common enemy, and they will once again understand who is their actual enemy, and who is causing all these troubles, who is causing, for example, also these troubles with the economic crisis in Iran. It's not the Iranian government. Of course, the Iranian government is not perfect. They are also doing mistakes like every other government, but the actual problem are the sanctions by the US and the international sanctions. So I think the Iranians once again are now understanding this, and this is very valuable and important for them and for the other resistance forces all over the world.
So, Mr. Larudee, if we go into the personality of General Soleimani, actually Tobias mentioned some of them in our previous question, but what was the main
to narrow it down to one characteristic, but one thing that is important for his role in his service to his country is his the fact that he's a highly strategic individual. He thinks not only in short-term strategy, but in the longer term, the benefit to the country and the objectives, both military objectives and other objectives for the benefit of Iran. And in this respect, he is not hasty in his. He has not been hasty in his actions or his orders or his judgments. You could say he proceeds with caution, but if caution is not is not called for by the situation, then he will take risks as well. He was as Tobias pointed out, he's he will take risks if there's a good reason, a principled reason, and a strategic reason to do so. So these are some of the qualities that brought him the tremendous importance that he had in the Iranian society and in the Iranian government. And he's a great loss in that respect. I think everyone agrees on that, even if sometimes not everyone agreed with his particular decisions. But nevertheless, as compared with some of the advisors of the U.S. government, like John Bolton, I wish we had him in that role instead. But he's been a really great asset. If Iran is able to find another individual of that quality, it will be very fortunate.
If you want to go into the response of Iran towards this kind of terrorist act, in your idea, what should be the response of for such an act? And as you know, today, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was also talking and focusing on this subject, and he explained so many things about this event. But in your idea, what would be the correct response from Iran to USA?
I think that this is a very critical question. You know, it is very hard to determine what kind of response the US should expect and what kind of response the Iran actually should let follow up on this. Because I think, in my opinion, actually Trump, even with this attack, he was not actually searching for a direct confrontation with Iran. Trump is not a person who is trying to directly confront another state. He's trying to put pressure onto economy. He's trying to like, for example, in Syria also, he was trying to save the oil fields for the US so that another economic pressure could be applied upon to Syria. I think he was not completely aware of how radical his action actually was to target somebody so high from the Iranian military. So I think he was not, in the beginning when he took this decision, I think he was not clear about, he did not understand actually that what kind of consequences can follow upon, because I think that this kind of action is a direct declaration of war of the United States against Iran. And I think that the Iranian government is very much well understanding it as this, while Trump himself, he is not understanding it like this. He thinks he just killed somebody, and that's all he thinks. I think he just thought like it's a little, like hurting somebody with a needle. Maybe the needle might be hurtful, but it can be for somebody a direct attack. So I think that Iran must be now clear about the consequences which will follow up, because they must react on this. It's absolutely clear that they cannot let this just happen and do nothing, but they must be, they must to keep it into aspect, because now Trump is even going further. He's going even more crazy, in my opinion, where he tells about attacking up to 52 even cultural sites of Iran. Probably he means Shiite cultural sites, probably in Iraq and other countries, maybe Syria and so on. So I think that's already a step of escalation, which is pretty high also from him, because he has, again, in my opinion, no understanding about what he actually is doing over there. So if Trump, for example, is attacking up to 52 cultural sites, and he can't do it because he withdrew from UNESCO, so it's very funny that he can actually do it even under international law. So if he does it like also Daesh did actually, then I think that is a direct attack onto all of the Shiite Muslims in the world. And I think that is something which Trump does not at all calculate, and he's not understanding the situation well enough. So I think that Iran must follow up with some actions, And I think that these actions should, of course, include the complete removal of US forces from Iraq, the expelling of US forces from Iraq, like the Iraqi government right now already decided that they must leave the country. And I think with that, we will also have another very good consequence, which will actually be that the US must also leave Syria and all the Syrian oil wells behind, because the US can't operate in Syria without having resupplies from Iraq. So I think that we will see some bigger shifts over there in power. I think that also in the question of Lebanon, we will see some bigger events happening, because I think still that the United States is in some kind of power struggle with Iran about Lebanon, about Iraq, and also even about Syria. So, in my opinion, this will shift. So Iran will get a way higher influence right now on Iraq, on Lebanon, on Syria than it even had before. So actually the consequences of this, in my opinion, are the complete expelling of US forces from the Middle Eastern regions like Iraq and Syria. And we will even see, I think, higher and broader tensions with the US. I think that this escalation, and I hope that it will not lead into a direct war between the USA and Iran, because this could mean another world war, and we must be full aware of the consequences which will unfold then. And it will not be only that the Iranian people will suffer on it, it will be thousands of US soldiers who will be killed. It will have dramatic consequences on the whole world, so we need to be fully aware of this. But I think that rather we will see some kind of power shift in the Middle East from the US towards Iran. Also, we need to consider all these conflicts happening right now are also some kind of placeholder conflicts between the US and Iran. So in Yemen, I think Iran should go into Yemen and help the Yemeni people under all circumstances. They should go there, they should be present there with military, they should help. They should help to expel the US from Syria and Iraq, and I think also Iran should continue its support to the resistance movement in Lebanon, to the Palestinian resistance, and I think by not only soft power but also hard power, but hard power which is not direct confrontation, but confrontation via some proxy forces with the US in the region. I think Iran must strengthen its own position and show revenge for this criminal act, for this war crime of the US against Iran. And I really hope that it won't escalate into a global conflict, but I think that any consequence which could happen right now, we saw some kind of lighter consequences, some hacking of US websites, government websites, but I think that this situation is really dangerous, and I think that Iran must follow up with consequences, and they must be militarily, and I think that there will be some kind of blood flooding, but I hope for now that this will not escalate into a global conflict. But if it happens, I really hope that Iran will find more partners, more international partners, which will declare solidarity with them, like Russia, and that also maybe China, and that this will, at least calm down the situation a bit. But let us see what happens. I think consequences must follow, and I think they must be very dramatic.
Okay, thank you, Tobias. Okay, Mr. Larudee, I would like to somehow ask the same question, but with another focus. As Tobias covered this subject, there might be some, consequences if Iran does any kind of retaliation. And as he said, Trump doesn't have any understanding of what he's doing, and he's not doing things based on any kind of special rule. It seems that he's just keeping on, doing things that he doesn't have any understanding of the consequences of such acts. So, but I would like to ask about your own idea. So, Mr. Larudee, do you think that any retaliation from Iran would cause a direct war with United States of America?
Okay, well, I certainly agree with Tobias in his analysis of the situation, and Trump himself does not have a good appreciation of the consequences of his actions, and that his own analysis is very poor. But I cannot say the same for his advisors, and his advisors are chiefly Zionists with very close relations with Israel, and in effect, a lot of the advice that they are getting, both in the military and the diplomatic corps and in the National Security Agency, it's coming from Israel, and Israel is even more powerful in the Congress. So these people have a perfect appreciation of what's going on, and they're ready to sacrifice the United States for the sake of Israeli objectives. That's part of what's going on here. Now, having said that, I do think there are still a majority of people in the State Department and the CIA and the military who do not want and will not allow a direct war between the U.S. and Iran. And I don't think that Iran wants that either. They need to have some kind of retaliation, but that they don't want a war would be a bigger problem for Iran than it would be for the US, but it'll be a big problem for both of them. The United States doesn't do direct wars anymore. It operates with proxy troops like Daesh, like al-Nusra or Hayat Tahrir Shem, and other proxy troops, mercenary troops, you could say. So it's not possible to have a complete war, a direct war under such circumstances. All they want to do is to cause as much trouble as possible, to destroy the economy, and ultimately what they want is regime change and to create a regime that obeys the United States in these situations. That seems highly unlikely that they will get it. They weren't able to get it in Syria, and it's even less likely that they will be able to get it in Iran and Russia, and to some extent China has learned its lesson from Libya. You don't give permission for the UN to go in and create a so-called safe zone. So Russia will be more inclined, and other powers will be more inclined to work with Iran to prevent such situations from arising. So I don't think there's very much likelihood that the retaliation from Iran will lead to a direct war, but it could lead to a kind of war of attrition with going back and forth. I do think that Russia and China and some European powers and others are likely to step in and try to prevent that from happening, to calm the situation. We should remember that in a similar situation, Hezbollah, when it was attacked in the Julan, that it retaliated, but it retaliated in a way that hit Israel very directly, but did not take advantage of the situation because they had the opportunity to destroy helicopters who arrived on the scene to rescue their soldiers that were attacked by Hezbollah. And they could have created a casualty rate that was much higher than the one that Israel caused to Hezbollah. But they didn't. Their retaliation was proportionate. Russia, its aircraft were hit and destroyed both by Israel indirectly, that caused it to come down, and also directly by Turkey. And in neither case did it send its military forces to cause damage directly to either Turkey or Israel. Instead, they provided more sophisticated missiles to Syria on the one hand, and they got concessions from Turkey in order to create a closer relationship that relied on cooperation without any what you could call retaliation for the death of their fighter pilot. So there's a range of the kinds of retaliation at the disposal of Iran, and it remains to see what form Iran's retaliation will take. But I don't think there's going to be a direct war.
I would like to go into the last question, and I would ask Mr. Pfennig about this question, which is the last question. But as you know, after assassination of General, last question, and I would ask Mr. Pfennig about this question, which is the last question. But as you know, after assassination of General Soleimani, there might be some kind of effects or changes in the course of resistance, or in the way that it's actually some the claims of some people that there might be some changes in the way that resistance is doing its activity in the region. But I would like to ask if it is true or not. I mean, Tobias, do you think that there would be a huge change or a huge change of course in the way the resistance is active in the region? And as Mr. Larudee says, there might be some attempts from USA in order to make new proxies in order to fight against Iran or the resistance bloc in the region. So, do you think any kind of any kind of changes would happen about the situation of?
I think that we won't see like a dramatic shift or a dramatic new development. I think that the resistance forces will continue with their initial plans, which were already made before the death of Soleimani and so on. So I think that let's just go back a bit. Let's just go back a bit to understand better the situation. So the US is losing its war in Syria. By losing its war in Syria, they're still trying to keep their position somehow by pressuring the Syrian economy, by keeping the oil wells and so on, by keeping some kind of food into the country. But also we see that the US has some problems in other countries, like for example Lebanon, and they're trying to pressure Lebanon. So in Lebanon, because of Hezbollah, because I think Trump is, one of his main targets is Iran, and he thinks that Hezbollah is only a proxy force of Iran, which is not true like that. They are Lebanese resistance movement, which is of course supported by Iran, which they are grateful for their support by Iran. But of course it's a resistance movement from the Lebanese people against the Zionists, against all the forces which are trying to destroy Lebanon and the Lebanese people. So what is happening right now, I think we are seeing more and more conflict going up in Lebanon, with protests over there, with the devaluation of the Lebanese pound, which is very, it's a very dramatic situation, I think, for Lebanon, because it will drive a lot of poor people into even worse poverty. It will cause troubles for Syrian economy, because the majority of money of the Syrian big money is all in Lebanon, in Lebanese pounds, and it's also causing problems for the Syrian economy right now. So Trump is trying to, still trying to attack Syria, still trying to attack Iran, still trying to attack Lebanon. They're doing the same in Iraq. They're afraid of losing influence in Iraq. They are afraid that Iran could play a bigger role in Iraq, and that would of course mean that if, for example, Iraq, Syria and Iran would cooperate on their oil exports, they would be like a huge superpower on oil. They would have probably around 30% of the global oil exports. It would be a huge blow to the market, and they could almost control the whole oil market. So we need to keep that in mind, and we need to keep in mind that the US had already all these plans to push back Iranian influence, let's say that in quotation marks, because that's what the US is saying, on the region. So they were focusing already on Lebanon, they were focusing on Iraq, and General Soleimani and the Iranians, I think they were very well aware of that, and they were just countering these attacks. So basically, with all the actions which the US did, with all the support of Daesh and so on, in the end, they were always strengthening Iran in the region, and that's something which the US also needs to understand. Basically, they are creating still a bigger power for Iran also with their actions. It's a very, very interesting fact, actually, if you consider this. So, actually, I think that also the US was already in some kind of bigger clash in Iraq, because we had these big PMUs, the private military units in Iraq, which are gaining more and more of a factor, not only militarily, but also politically, which could play an influence in reshaping Iraq towards maybe something which is more leaning towards Iran than towards the US, of course. And the US was understanding the situation. And the CIA, I think there was also a change in the strategy of the CIA. I think that in the recent years, the CIA was more about targeted killings, and we need to consider that and remember that when it's about Soleimani. For example, just another example, in Donbass, in former parts of eastern Ukraine, which are now with Russia, the US was, or via its proxy forces, via Ukrainian Secret Service, probably aided by the CIA, even the Russian Secret Service found out that the Ukrainian Secret Service can have done these operations on their own. They were using targeted killings, for example, against the former president of the DNR, Donetsk People's Republic, Sakharchenko. They were using targeted killing against him, a terrorist attack basically against him, to eliminate one of the leaders of the resistance over there. And he was not the only one who was targeted. There were dozens of other high-ranking leaders who were attacked. And I think that Soleimani, also the boss of the Iraqi Hezbollah, they were all high-ranking people which the US is trying to liquidate right now. They're trying to kill them to weaken the resistance in the world. And the CIA probably switched from this former strategy of more open confrontation towards target killings at the top levels, because they understand that these top level leaders are very valuable for our resistance movements. And I think that is something which is also threatening ourselves, because we need to understand that every high ranking official could be somebody on the target list of the US. And I think, and then all of that, Trump thought maybe we can stop what is happening in Iraq. I mean, the US administration was clearly, in my opinion, supporting the protesters in Iraq who were against the PMUs and against Iran. And of course, Iran had some involvement with the PMUs. So I think Trump was fearing before this attack that that the US administration could lose its grip on Iraq, that it could lose its military presence in Iraq. And this attack was, I think, a last final attempt to stop this process, which was unfolding, which is still unfolding. But I think Trump does not realize, and even the US administration who helped him to I think that the US has to pull out of the region, and this will basically the best option for the US itself, for the US administration, for the US people, and also for the US military, because the process which already started, they can't stop with some targeted killing like they did. They can't stop it with more military escalation. They just can't do it. So the best option for them would be just to leave. So that is actually what Trump should do at this point.
This was the last question of the program. I would like to thank both of you for your contributions to this program and for your detailed and also informative explanations about the questions. So thank you, Mr. Paul Larudee, and also Mr. Tobias Pfennig. It was a great honor to have you on this program, and hope to have you again on next episode. Thank you.